First of all, I'm thrilled to have an actual pen because I am very old school, and I actually write my books a lot by longhand. I write up my interviews for my radio show longhand, and I'm always going through pens. So the pen is actually a great gift in addition to being a great symbol for this extraordinary award. And I thank you so much for that warm welcome. It means the world to me to have all of you here, such good friends, so many people that I admire for so many reasons. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy day to be here today. Andy, God bless you. You are such a dear personal friend of mine, and you are such a hero to this republic. Andy McCarthy was one of very few voices pre-9/11. After 9/11, everybody's attention was really focused on radical Islam and the fact that we were in the crosshairs of radical Islam, which not a lot of people were focused on before the September 11th attacks. Andy McCarthy was one of those voices in the wilderness, Frank Gaffney, Steve Emerson, a few others, but they were lonely out there. And God bless you for keeping up the fight, particularly when nobody was watching, and even now when it seems like nobody is watching. Andy McCarthy, God bless you, and thank you for that extraordinary introduction. And then there's Frank Gaffney, also a dear friend, and actually one of my oldest friends, I think, here in the room. I just have to remind everybody how we met, because this was the early 1990s, and I was working as foreign policy assistant to former President Richard Nixon. And one day a phone call came in, and it was Frank. And since I was there as President Nixon's foreign policy assistant, the phone call was directed to me, and I had no idea who Frank was, except he introduced himself as former Undersecretary of Defense for President, did I get that right? Assistant Secretary of Defense under President Reagan. So right away I was dazzled and impressed. Reagan, of course, my big hero, Richard Nixon also. So I take the phone call in my best professional voice, Monica Crowley here. How can I help you? And he said that he wanted to, if possible, to come and see President Nixon to talk about the ABM Treaty, which President Nixon had signed with Leonid Brezhnev in 1972. And because the Soviet Union was no more, Frank thought, in his wisdom, and of course he was right, because he's right about everything, that since the other signatory to the treaty no longer existed, that he should get the American signatory to call it null and void and call for vacating the treaty. So I said to President Nixon, Frank Gaffney would like to come see you about vacating the ABM treaty, and his eyes got huge. And he said, all right, bring him up. So Frank came to see President Nixon and used his considerable powers of persuasion on the president, and the president agreed to disavow the ABM treaty. Thanks to Frank. And then President Nixon used his considerable powers of persuasion on Henry Kissinger, and the two of them very publicly disavowed the treaty. Now, it took a couple of years for the United States then to disavow the treaty, but ultimately George W. Bush finally did, and it's due to Frank. Frank is to be commended and honored for his single-minded focus and total dedication to this nation's security. He is often a one-man band. He's often attacked in the most grotesque and vicious ways, and he's also a voice in the wilderness. But he is always right, and he's always vindicated. And so we salute you for your gracefulness and your quiet heroism, and sometimes not so quiet heroism. God bless you, Frank. Thank you. Well, to quote a recent bestseller, what the bleep just happened? I hear that book is pretty good, by the way. So here we are, we're a couple of weeks after the presidential election, and I think a lot of us in this room would agree that we're still walking around in a very surreal haze of utter disbelief about these results. And I know, if you're like me, we can't really believe it. I mean, part of me sometimes feels that we're going to wake up and it's going to be like October 20th, and the hurricane will not have happened, and the election will not have happened, and everything of the last couple of weeks will have just been a bad dream. We all weren't seeing things when we looked at the polls that showed either a tied race or Governor Romney ahead. We weren't seeing things when we saw the energy on the Republican side and the huge rallies for Romney and Paul Ryan. And I think that's why the results were so utterly shocking 4 years ago, we hoped John McCain would do it, but I think all of us deep down knew that was not going to be the case. This time around, it was different. This time we saw real energy on our side and proactive energy on our side. Not just a default, well, this guy's not so bad, but we actually saw a real turnaround, especially after the first presidential debate, where people actually were excited about voting for Romney rather than just against Barack Obama. And that's why I think the results of the evening of November 6th are still so startling and disturbing to all of us in this room. Today, given the work of Frank and the Center for Security Policy, I want to focus on our national security, because Frank is right when he says that there hasn't been a lot of attention being paid to these critical issues. All you have to do is look at the coverage of Benghazi, where you have 4 dead Americans, including the personal representative of the President of the United States, the U.S. ambassador, 2 former Navy SEALs, and a longtime Foreign Service officer. All you have to do is look at the lack of media coverage on that story to know what's going on in America, and also to know at least a little bit about what's going on with this foreign policy. Bill and I, a couple of weeks ago, went to see the movie Argo, and if you haven't gone to see it, I commend it to you. It's outstanding. But when you go to see it, you're catapulted back to 1979. And one of the opening scenes, it's actually a long, sort of 15, 20-minute scene of the takeover of the U.S. Embassy by radical Islamists. And then after the taking of the hostages, they flash back to the American homeland. And for those of us who lived through it, of course, I was a very little girl, very, very little girl in 1979. But we all remember the yellow ribbons that everybody put out. They hung their trees with them on their mailboxes. The American people were outraged that our fellow citizens had been taken hostage by a radical Islamic force half a world away. We were screaming at President Carter, and we denied him re-election, not solely because of that. The economy was a huge issue also. But the Iran hostage crisis played a huge role because the American people were horrified that our fellow citizens were being held hostage, number one. But what it symbolized, number two, which was the abject humiliation of the United States of America. Flash forward, 35 years, and here we are. Where is the outrage? Where are the American people marching on the White House, screaming at President Obama about how this could have happened, how he could allow the abject humiliation of the United States of America? Remember, the Iranian hostage crisis, nobody died, thank God. Here we've got 4 dead American bodies and crickets out there in the homeland, crickets. A lot of it is due to the corrupt media. Thank God for Fox News. Thank God for the New York Post, the Wall Street Journal, a few other outlets, talk radio, of which I am blessed to be a part. But other than that, it just doesn't get covered. And so part of the lack of outrage is the lack of coverage, of course. But also, I fear that something bigger is happening in the country. And that is that Barack Obama and the far left have so changed the nature of America that it may be almost impossible, if not impossible, to reverse. I do want to focus on our national security today and why we are where we are, which is in a period of accelerated American decline. Accelerated, and this is a very tough point for the American mind to process, but that period of accelerated American decline is being accelerated by the commander-in-chief. The commander-in-chief is a position, it's a man, maybe someday it'll be a woman, not Hillary Clinton. But the role of commander-in-chief, this is the person in whom we trust to protect and defend us, but in whose hands now we are set on a path, a very deliberate path, a very rapid and dangerous descent. So in order to understand where we are right now and where we're going, we've got to understand the commander-in-chief, first and foremost, where he comes from and what his philosophy is. I want to take you back to September 19th, 2001. I remember that day really well because it was only 8 days after the 9/11 attacks and the wounds were still really raw and fresh. And I also remember that day, it's in my mind because it happened to be my birthday, and just 8 days after the attacks made that birthday particularly dark and grim. For those of you who were here in New York, and even if you weren't, you'll remember that for weeks after the attack, but certainly during that first week, there was a very surreal mood in the country. I mean, this city was almost at a standstill, in near silence. You still had emergency personnel looking for somebody, anybody still alive in that twisted wreckage. We had a dark cloud of grief hanging over New York and Washington and Shanksville, Pennsylvania, but indeed across the entire country. The whole nation was paralyzed because we had never seen an attack like this. Surprise attack, terrorist attack. It gave rise to fear and anger and dread and uncertainty that our whole reality was now different. But it also gave rise to this great sense of pride, right? In the heroism shown by so many people who, when those buildings were burning and everybody was running out, they were running in. And we also shared this deep-seated faith that America would smash the enemy, because that's what America does, and that we would emerge stronger. On that day, September 19th, 2001, given this whole context, an undistinguished, very undistinguished state senator from Illinois wrote a piece, and he published it in a nondescript Chicago area publication called the Hyde Park Herald. No, it's hot, right? Hyde Park, that's like Vanity Fair. So he wrote this piece, and by the way, if you try to look it up now, you can't, because Obama and his team have scrubbed it from the internet, so you can't find it. But I want to share with you part of what he wrote, because it's very telling, and it gives you a context into his mind and his mindset, and how we get things like Benghazi, and how we get things like the $1.2 trillion defense sequester that has already kicked in. He wrote this. This was his, he started with sort of a routine description about how we need heightened airport security and more effective intelligence operations and routine points like that. And then he said this, quote, "We must also engage, however, in the more difficult task of understanding the sources of such madness." It's not difficult at all, Mr. Obama. It's totalitarian Islam. He continued, "The essence of this tragedy," and note he says tragedy instead of act of war, "the essence of this tragedy, it seems to me, derives from a fundamental absence of empathy on the part of the attackers, an inability to imagine or connect with the humanity and suffering of others. They were jihadists, driven by their clearly articulated faith to kill the infidel, not empathize with them." But Obama keeps going back to the word empathy. He continues, "Such a failure of empathy, such numbness to the pain of a child or the desperation of a parent is not innate, nor history tells us is it unique to a particular culture, religion, or ethnicity. It may find expression in a particular brand of violence and may be channeled by particular demagogues or fanatics. Most often, though, you ready for this? Most often, though, it grows out of a climate of poverty and ignorance, helplessness and despair." As if we should have responded to the 9/11 attacks by airlifting food stamps and subsidized housing to al-Qaeda, which, by the way, after we have armed al-Qaeda in Libya, I'm sure the food stamps aren't too far behind. Isn't it really interesting the way the left describes all enemies of the United States in almost the exact same way? Whether it's totalitarian communism or totalitarian Islam, the left always portrays these movements as a result of inequality and never as the militantly anti-American movements that they really are. Those who carried out the 9/11 attacks, they weren't ignorant and they weren't poor, by the way. They were middle to upper middle class and highly educated. But they weren't ignorant, they were jihadis. Obama went on in the piece to counsel patience, of course, and against overreacting, as he called it. And then he wrote this, quote, "Finally, we will have to devote far more attention to the monumental task of raising the hopes and prospects of embittered children across the globe. Children not just in the Middle East, but also in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and within our own shores. The United States had just been attacked by a barbaric and ruthless enemy, almost 3,000 of our fellow Americans dead in the street, slaughtered in cold blood, and the nation was seized by grief. And yet Barack Obama took that moment to express compassion for the enemy, concern over imaginary American bigotry, a desire to socially engineer the rest of the world, and also an urge to apparently belt out the Whitney Houston song, "The Children Are Our Future." He placed all of the responsibility for the enemy's attacks upon us, and then he blamed us for regarding them as an enemy. It was astonishing. Obama's first instinct was not to share in our national suffering, not even to offer a note of sympathy to the families, or even to recognize, God forbid, that these attacks were acts of war. Instead, it was that immediate left-wing, knee-jerk, anti-American radical reaction that the United States is at the root of all evil, that it's our fault that there's so much injustice in the world, and that therefore we deserve the hatred directed at us. American exceptionalism, and this illuminates his point about, well, I believe in American exceptionalism the way the British believe in British exceptionalism, or the Germans believe in German exceptionalism. American exceptionalism, in his mind, and in the minds of the far left, created these imbalances between the have nations and the have-not nations. We've been a bully, throwing our weight around the world and tossing foreign lands and peoples aside when they were no longer of use to us. Western civilization overall is evil, dominated by white heterosexual Judeo-Christians, and especially white heterosexual Judeo-Christian males, the horror of that. And America, of course, was particularly guilty because she was born into slavery and then sought to emulate the noxious imperialism of Great Britain and France. Dinesh D'Souza writes about this in The Roots of Obama's Rage, about the anti-colonialism that has driven Obama, and I think he's completely right about this. So in order to make up for 200 years of global rampaging, Obama and the left believe that we have to apologize openly and retrench. We've got to turn the United States from being a thuggish superpower into just another country, no better than any other nation, no more powerful, no more moral, no more influential. The mission of Obama and the far left is nothing short of this: the ultimate downgrade of American power. We tend to think of the phrase and use the phrase downgrade in economic terms. And yes, we're about to face another economic downgrade, by the way, with $16.3 trillion in debt. But remember that the objective of Obama and the far left is so much bigger than just downgrading our economic situation and our debt. It's about downgrading American power across the board. The way they are seeking to do this, they are so clever at this. We on the right, as conservatives, we're always playing checkers, and the left is always playing chess. We're dealing with very sophisticated leftist psychology on the other side. Just look at Occupy Wall Street, which was set into motion months before you actually saw people in the streets. It was all designed to provide Obama with his central campaign theme, which was income inequality. Part of that also drives his approach to the world. But what he's doing is not just limiting his social engineering here at home. It's about social engineering the rest of the world. It's about being a global redistributionist. So what he has sought to do, and he has had enormous success in just 4 short years, is to redistribute everything that has made America great. If he were just limited to redistributing wealth here at home, it would be horrifying, because none of us here want to be socialists, but we could try to manage it, we could try to mitigate it, we could try to get a great candidate 4 years from now who could try to reverse it. The problem is that what he is doing is so much bigger. It's part of a leftist grand project that has been in the works for decades, and it wasn't until Obama got into the presidency that they were able to accelerate that process. So what do I mean by redistributing everything that's made America great? It's not just our wealth here at home. It's our military and economic power. It's our diplomatic influence. Look, we've got a dead ambassador in Benghazi and not a word. Our cultural strength, our political appeal, and most importantly, of course, our principle of individual freedom. I call it in the book that Andy so graciously talked about, I call it Obama's Declaration of Dependence. Founders gave us a great Declaration of Independence. Obama's turned that on its head. And it's being applied internationally, not just here at home, but to our global leadership. He is trying to make us increasingly dependent on other nations and multilateral institutions like the United Nations. He's trying to get us to lean on international law over American law and interests. And ultimately, of course, he's trying to seek transnationalism, which is one world global governing regime, which is something that Andy has written about and warned about for years now, and it's very real and it's very dangerous. They honestly believe that this constitutional republic, because it is the root of all evil in the world, has no claim to global exceptionalism, never mind national exceptionalism. In his very first address as president to the UN in September of 2009, Obama said exactly that. And look, in all of these arguments that I'm making, it's not Monica Crowley saying this. You can go and look at Obama's exact words. It's him saying these things. He has never made a mystery of who he is and what he believes, what he intends to do, what he's doing, and what he will do in the future. He said at the UN in September '09, quote, "In an era where our destiny is shared, power is no longer a zero-sum game. No world order that elevates one nation or group over another will succeed." In other words, the US should be on par with Paraguay. That is the future America wants. Usually we send a president out into the world to speak on our behalf. Not this time, at least not for us. That was the future that we didn't want, but that Obama and the far left want. America overdone. Again, just another nation on the world block. That kind of anti-American radicalism you saw in that piece that he wrote on 9/11, which now you can no longer get, informs every single thing he does as commander-in-chief. And every time you see a foreign policy story or think about whether or not Obama really wants to go over the fiscal cliff, look at it from that lens. Understand the man, and you will understand what he is doing. People argue, oh, Obama doesn't want to go over the fiscal cliff. What are you, nuts? Of course he does. First of all, he needs the revenue of everybody's tax rates going up. Secondly, he knows he'll never get blamed for it. The Republicans will get blamed for everything, so he can cruise right in. But the other important element of this is the defense sequester, which Frank has been talking about and arguing against valiantly for so long. The only thing Obama's willing to cut is defense. And boy, is he getting it. $500 billion already, another $500 billion to come at least. So going over the cliff, Obama gets everything he wants. He gets the higher tax rates and he gets the gutted US military. Do you remember the 3 a.m. phone call ad? 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton ran this ad, 3 a.m. phone call, questioning Obama's national security experience and his judgment. And the question posed to all of us, I suppose, was who do you feel more comfortable with as commander-in-chief when that phone rings at an ungodly hour? Do you want the junior senator from New York, whose national security experience was apparently limited to whatever knowledge she gained through osmosis as First Lady, or did you want the junior senator from Illinois, whose foreign policy experience was apparently limited to visits to Epcot with his girls? Well, fast forward to today, and you have this Tweedledee, Tweedledum national security equation of Hillary and Barry, and it's got a whole new meaning, right? Because in many cases, the former junior senator from New York is now placing that 3 a.m. phone call as Secretary of State. So you can see we really never had a choice 4 years ago because these two foreign policy nitwits ended up talking to each other. Joe Biden also had warned about this early on where he said the American president was going to be tested. Remember that? He said, we're about to elect a brilliant young 47-year-old man as president like Jack Kennedy. He's going to be tested. And it was true. And those tests came in the form of Somali pirates, domestic terror attacks like the one at Fort Hood, the Christmas Day and Times Square bombers, rogue regimes like Iran and Syria, which slaughtered their own people in the streets as they were trying to voice for greater freedom, and also why their regimes marched toward nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction. And of course, the Muslim Brotherhood sweeping to power unchecked, in fact, encouraged by this administration. The tests haven't always been tests. The virtue of America has always been in our genuine do-goodism. And we've always been able to project power and strength, and as President Reagan once put it, strength through power. We've never been afraid to use that power and to use that influence for good. And as a result, we've always been able to be feared and respected in the world. That's no longer true. The United States, in our brief history here, we've spent more blood and treasure liberating people from tyranny and oppression than any other nation in the world, and we've also asked for the least in return. But the leftists don't see this as a good and noble thing. They see it as an evil thing. And they also see it as something that needs to be changed, or in Obama's words, fundamentally transformed. In order to fundamentally transform America, the leftists have to do internationally what they are doing here domestically. And that means realigning the global power structure to take America down the totem pole of power. Remember leading from behind? Here's what leading from behind is really based on. And these points were actually explicitly made by that Obama senior official who was quoted in that New Yorker piece. When he was quoted as saying leading from behind, what didn't get covered were his 5 points about America, which came directly from Obama. First, that America is in decline. Secondly, the decline is inevitable, and therefore Obama's job is to manage it, not to fight it. Actually, I would argue to accelerate it. Third, China is passing us on the world stage. Fourth, everybody hates us, so we shouldn't do anything to make them hate us more. And finally, by what he called shepherding us through this phase of accelerated American decline, they don't mean to stronger, sunnier days ahead the way Reagan talked about it. They mean to weaker, darker days of diminished power. And it's all being done deliberately. It's all by design. President Obama has no problem being a surrender-in-chief. Not a commander-in-chief, a surrenderer-in-chief. He is operating intentionally as a declinist. And what they have done in 4 short years, and I shudder to think what the next 4 holds for the United States, but they are leaving America on her knees, staggering, bleeding, and leaving the rest of the world to run amok. We've seen this before when the leftists have had control over our foreign policy, and the movie never ends well. So what do? We all know in this room that, as President Nixon once put it, there is no substitute for American power. But we also know that we are stuck here for a while, and the country is stuck leading from behind for a while. So what do? Well, given that Obama has now another 4 years at least, dun, dun, dun. By the way, on this point, I don't think this is a totally crazy thing because Obama has spent the last 4 years shredding the Constitution almost on a daily basis, which is what I write about in What the Bleep Just Happened. Every day, I was doing research for the book, and every day I would say, oh, I forgot about that. That's really crazy. I have to write that up. And then the next day, oh, I forgot he did this. That's really crazy. I better write that up. I ended up with a 600-page manuscript because literally every single day this man has inflicted some leftist madness on us or some insane unconstitutional mandate on the American people or just gone around the Constitution completely. So there's nothing holding him back from attempting to disregard the 22nd Amendment. He said something in his convention speech, his acceptance speech at the convention, which caught my attention. And everybody sort of focused on one part of the sentence and I focused on the other. He said, and I quote, Franklin Roosevelt needed more time for his experimentation. Everybody sort of focused on the experimentation part of that sentence. I focused on the Franklin Roosevelt part of that sentence because Roosevelt had 4 terms. Just a thought. So we have at least 4 years of Barack Obama, and our challenges did just get a lot steeper. But that doesn't mean we just pack it in and we just give up the fight. I know that a lot of us are having a hard time being the happy warriors that I wrote about in the book and that Andy and Frank describe. And I know the three of us, everybody in this room, naturally sort of are happy warriors. And I know it's really tough right now to be that way. I have to say, every time I go on the radio or television, it's all I can do to build up a head of steam to try to convey to the American people that we can do this. But we can do it. And when it comes to national security in particular, we have to take whatever corner we're in, because obviously we're not in the corridors of power right now. So whatever corner we're in, we should focus on two things. One, to try to reestablish from the outside, or at least pressure this administration from the outside, to develop a central organizing principle for American foreign policy that is based on US strength and values, rather than on defeatism and decline. We have to let this administration know from the outside that we're not going to put up with that. Also, that we will be willing to fight and stand up for American values, especially when it comes to people around the world, like the Iranian people 4 years ago who stood up and were fighting for a greater voice in their own affairs and what we value here in America, human rights and so on. That when those people around the world give expression to that we, the American people, will stand up and back them up, even when the American administration will not. Second major priority, I think, for us on the outside is our military strength. And this is something that Frank does every single day of his life. As I mentioned, $500 billion sequester already happening, another $500 billion more to come if the sequester goes through, which of course Obama wants. No responsible commander-in-chief would allow this to happen, to allow our military to be gutted and to have this nation irretrievably crippled. His own defense secretary, Leon Panetta, said this point blank. We can't let these cuts go through. We will not be able to defend ourselves and our allies and our interests. No responsible commander-in-chief would go down that road, but this one will. He not only will, he wants to. And so whatever we can do on the outside in these fierce budget battles ahead, and I know money is tight, we're broke, country has $16.3 trillion in debt. But one thing we need to do from the outside and from our positions, regardless of where we are, is to make the very simple, straightforward argument that I haven't heard anybody make so simply before, but can really grab the American people. That if we go through with this defense sequester, none of the domestic priorities will matter. None of them will matter if we are all dead. Defense is first. I want to leave you with a very quick story that I write about in What the Bleep Just Happened, because every time I recount it, it makes me very emotional about America and about where we are. Right after Obama became president, I got in a cab here in New York City, and it was just a short trip. Maybe I was going to see Bill, I don't know. But I remember this cab driver. He was huge, very hairy, and he spoke with a heavy Eastern European accent. So at one point in the ride, he was sort of chatting with me, and he looked at me. He said, "You're an American, yes?" And I said, "Yeah." And I turned to him and I said, where are you from? Where's that accent from? And he said, "The Bronx." And then he stopped, he kind of laughed, and then he said, "Oh, you mean where am I from?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I was born in Bulgaria, but I am an American." And then he got emotional and he said this to me. He said, "I'm an American by choice. And you'll forgive me, but I think those of us who are Americans by choice, rather than by birth, have a different view. Many Americans, you do not appreciate your freedom. You have always had it, and you don't know anything else. I've lived under communism," he said. He said, "I've been beaten and put in jail. I've heard the knock of the secret police at my door in the middle of the night. I've had neighbors disappear. I've had the government open my mail and listen in on my phone. I've gone days eating only potatoes because the store shelves were bare. There was no medicine, no good doctors," he said. And he told me that his family had fled Bulgaria obviously to escape the tyranny and brutal oppression of the communists there. And he said they came to America. It wasn't just fleeing the negative, it was going toward the positive, coming to America for freedom and everything that we represented, that shining city on a hill. And that's when he asked me, and he got strong and sort of gruff, and he said, tell me, what are you doing? And I said, what am I doing? I'm just sitting in the back seat, trying to get my tip ready. He said, tell me, what are you doing? Why are you letting America be destroyed? And then his voice started to quake, and he started talking about our enslaving debt, his words, enslaving debt, communist medicine, and a jackboot government. And then he drove up to my destination, and he threw his arm over the back of the chair, and he looked at me directly in my eyes, and he pleaded with me. He said, please don't let this happen to America. It's creeping in here, and it's creeping in fast. He said, we came to America to get away from socialism. If it comes here, where will we go? Where will any of us go? There's no hope anywhere else. And then he said something really powerful. He said, you're letting your freedoms be taken from you, and you don't even see it. Or you see it, but you don't care, which is the worst kind of treason. And that word treason hit me like a pile of bricks. Because I pride myself on being an American patriot. And what he was describing, even though all of us in this room fight it every day, but were all of us on some level guilty of citizen malpractice because we were letting this go on, or rewarding Republicans over many years who were going down this road of big government and big spending. But that grizzled New York City cab driver also illuminated something very positive for me, which is the words of Abraham Lincoln when he referred to this country as the last best hope of earth. And he reminded me that despite our issues here, and we've got huge challenges, and they just got a lot worse after November 6th, but still, millions and millions of people look to us, still, as the last best hope of earth. And even now, though it feels like we're slipping beneath the waves of collectivism and state domination and socialism and human misery that we've seen in every corner of the globe, and we see it starting to happen here. Are we going to let this happen? Are we going to let our freedoms just dissipate and have American power atrophy? Or are we going to listen to the words of Thomas Paine, who said, quote, "It is the duty of the patriot to protect their country from its government." This is our job now. This is why we fight. And as tough as it is to be happy warriors, we've got to do it. We can't let the founders down. We can't let every generation that's come before us down. We can't let the greatest generation down. We can't let our children down. This is why we fight. And so it's time to suit up again. Let's roll. God bless you.